In this video, I'm excited to show you how to use Fabricator. So this tool essentially allows you to build your own UI toolkit. What that means is that you could liken this to what you might have seen in Bootstrap or Materialize or other design frameworks like that, where you can browse a documentation site that shows off all the different components that have been designed, and read documentation about each of them, copy and paste sample markup, and then also easily grab a single style sheet for the entire toolkit and also a single JavaScript sheet if there's any JavaScript that needs to be included with it. So I think the easiest way to understand is to see. So let's take a look at an example of one of these from a project I've been working on recently. While this is starting, let me tell you more about the design process that went into this first. So like with most projects, we started with wireframes that gave us a sense of where we were going in terms of the overall components that we were going to need. So we designed each of the screens in very much rough wireframe form, and that let us know that, hey, yeah, we're going to need X number of headings, and paragraphs and all kinds of form widgets, but then also there were some specific layouts where we were going to need specific kinds of menus, like this here, as well as some kind of compound components where there's kind of a set of uniquely designed content that's really kind of the heart of what's going on in the application, as well as icons and all kinds of different shapes that we were going to need to design. So with the wireframes finished, we next moved into style tiles, which you're familiar with. So I won't show you the exact style tiles that I created, but after our client selected the style direction, I then fleshed that style tile out into a much more detailed set of components here. They're still very broad components, but they're more detailed than we might have put into a typical style tile. So you can see here a whole page where I fleshed out 4 different heading styles, paragraphs, lists, hyperlinks, and then some other custom or more specific kinds of typography things like form labels and form details and a lead paragraph and block quotes, and I even gave some sample code formatting in case code was needed to be shown on the actual project. We also did a variation of this in a light on dark, because we were going to have some places where we have an overlay, which you'll see here in a moment. We also fleshed out the colors with kind of a main color and then a darker shade and a lighter tint of each of those, so that we could have those as options for hover effects and things like that. We built or repurposed an icon library, as well as added some of our own custom icons, again with the dark on light as well as the light on dark. Our client also had a set of avatars that they wanted us to use, so we brought those in so we could see them beside everything and kind of keep them all in perspective. And then last of all, we designed some form components, both on the dark background, which is more representative of what you'll see than per se a flat dark like this, and then on a light background. So we imagined each of the different kinds of form components in the mobile layout, in keeping with what we were doing in our wireframe, and fleshed out. So this is a multi-line input, single line input with info text, single line input, toggle switch, checkboxes, drop-down list, and then a sample of a button style. All right, from there, then I actually built out mock-ups of a few pages just to try out these styles, as well as discover some new custom components we might need. So here you can see an example of the Manage Your Account page, where we have those form styles being laid out with lots of variations based on what we actually need in the comp, and I found that those component styles work just the way I wanted. Then we then moved into responsive, where we just kind of stretched these elements out and imagined how those very same elements might look on a wider device and on an even wider device. So we did 3 stops there. Another example of a mock-up you can see over here. This is the main gallery page for the app that we're building. And so we can see some of the more of that type in play, as well as some of the icons in use, and some other compound components like this web link and this image and other things like that. And then, of course, the discussion area that we fleshed out some of the actual shape of the discussion posts, and we tried out the avatars and context and other things like this. So basically, rather than design all, my goodness, there were 20-some screens in the wireframes that we built out. It'd be rather impractical to design every one of those screens. In reality, if you've got a good grid system and you've got a thorough consideration of UI components, you ought to be able to create a UI toolkit that you or developers can then use to plug in each of those components when they're needed based on the wireframe. So it starts by knowing what you need and then designing the components, or those little kind of plug-and-play pieces. So now we can move over to Fabricator and see how Fabricator helps out with this. This website that you're looking at is the documentation site that the Fabricator tool generates based on the components that you design. So you get to choose the structure for all of this stuff over here, and I'll explain that once we actually look at Fabricator. And you get to choose the markup that you use for each of your component pieces, and you get to choose the styles that you lay on. This documentation site then pulls together the notes that you add that document how things should be used. You can toggle on the markup. You can see it appeared down here. So we're giving either ourselves as a reminder or other developers who might be jumping in and using these styles examples, just like you might find on those really nice looking documentation sites for, say, Bootstrap and other things like that. So this thorough documentation is what we're talking about. By investing the time in styling all of these individual components, we have built a toolkit that others can use to build out any page within this site, and to do so consistently and with our designer's touch on it. One other thing I would say that I was able to do here that I'm pretty excited about is you can see each of these components demonstrated in line here, but I've also designed them to be responsive. So I can scale all the way down here in my documentation site and see, say, how some of those form components look, where everything is stacked. And then I can drag my browser window out a little bit and see how they adjust when we get to the portrait tablet arrangement, and go even further out to see what they look like at the desktop size. So that's pretty exciting. So these are kind of individual elements, you know, form fields and whatnot, and prescribed markup for each of them, as well as documentation suggesting the different variations that can be used and how to do further customizations and other things like that. The way that I've got this set up, I have all those kind of simple components first, and then I have these structures, which are the more complex things. So I have a whole set of classes like Bootstrap does for layout components to be able to create columns at various sizes, and these are all also responsive. Then I have a couple of these compound components like the application header, the application footer, a sample form so that you can see how all the elements look one after the other, and then as well as considering how some of these custom components would look all together. And then a sample of the gallery discussion and the markup that would go for that. And then sample gallery header, gallery items. So it's possible to be very thorough and to get into all kinds of both very small pieces as well as then kind of assembling larger pieces together. You can even take it to the full level here with the pages feature of actually pulling those components together into full pages and seeing how all of that works out. So let me go down to the mobile size here, and you can see how this kind of main account page worked out. Oops. And then if I go to another page, let's say the gallery home, again, how we end up building this out. So everything from designing the small pieces, like I did in that master style sheet, to designing some of the larger components, to then kind of putting everything together into a few sample pages to just show off how well they all work together. So that's the vision for what this tool does. Now let's look at the actual tool itself. I go stop my service there. Okay, so here's the website for Fabricator. It's hosted by GitHub. The author put it up here as a GitHub pages. And what we want to do to get started is to actually go to the docs. There is a quick start here, but I found the quick start page gives you more helpful information. So first of all, you want to make sure that you have Node.js installed. To check on that, you can open your terminal and type in node -- version. And you want to make sure that it tells you a Node version. So as long as you have Node, you should be good. You could also upgrade Node to make sure you have the latest if you'd like. The other thing we want to do is to use this second option down here that depends on having the Yeoman generator installed, and that you can install by typing in npm install yo. You also might prefer to do this globally with sudo npm install g yo. Okay, if you want any more about that, this hyperlink here takes you to the page that explains the partnership between Fabricator and Yeoman, and if you go to Yeoman itself, you've got that same idea here, npm install -g yo, and when we do -g, we usually have to do sudo in front of it. Okay, so that gives you the Yeoman generator. If you want to just make sure everything is installed, you can, of course, run yo version, and that will tell you what version of yo you have. If you're not sure about npm, same thing there. So you should have npm if you install Node, and you should easily be able to install yo with npm. Now we're going to follow these steps to install the Fabricator generator, which is going to help you quickly generate a full Fabricator site, shy of having to do the kind of cloning that's done up here. So you can type in npm install g generator Fabricator, and you'll probably want to put sudo in front of that and let that run. Once that's run, then you need to, what they didn't tell you is you probably want to actually navigate into the folder for the project that you want to install Fabricator into. So in my case, I have in the W3 projects folder, in my sites folder, I have a Fabricator Demo folder, so I'm going to traverse there now. cd sites, W3 projects, Fabricator Demo, and then I'm there. All right, so now that I'm in the folder, I can actually run the yo Fabricator. We can name the, it's going to default to the same name as the same folder that we're in, and that's good. So it's going to run the install, and then we'll be ready to go. When the install's done, it actually it's going to automatically launch the kind of default setup in the browser, so we'll see that when these are finished running. All right, when it's finished, you should see a site that looks like this that has just basically their kind of default setup in here, showing the Fabricator colors and some sample components over here on the left. So feel free to explore this to just kind of get to know that default setup. And I would say as well that the actual Fabricator documentation is very good. I learned a lot just by working through this and then trying things out. Didn't have to do a lot of searching around to find other answers. I found this documentation to be really nice. So that said, let me cover some of the highlights of how this works. Over in Atom, I'm going to open my project. Okay, so you can pretty much disregard the things that are out here in this outer folder. It's a bunch of scripts that make everything work the way it needs to. And for the most part, you shouldn't need to touch any of them unless you want to, say, update the README. But you could, in a real-world scenario, work with developers who might understand more about these things to kind of configure them. You can also disregard the Node modules folder. That is an NPM thing that installs all the kinds of dependencies that help everything run within this. So it's a great big folder. That's why it took so long to install. So just disregard that. So you're going to be doing most of your work in the source folder. And Fabricator is watching all the changes you make and instantly rebuilding the documentation site here in the dist folder. So what you're actually browsing over here in the browser are the files that are automatically created by Fabricator and placed here in this dist folder. So for example, here I am on the index page, which if I browse and look at the content, you can see here's this H1 below this F control bar, and if I open up index.html over here, you can see the same idea. There's the H1 under the F control bar. Okay, so just proof that that's indeed the same thing. So keep in mind that what Fabricator does is really kind of twofold. First of all, and I think the biggest case for using Fabricator is that it builds this documentation site. So the whole idea is we're not just doing styles. We are documenting the relationship between styles and the markup. And then when I say documenting, what I mean is that we can actually add notes around each individual component so that we remember ourselves how to use things, and we can also inform others how they should be using these components. Okay, so that was number one, is that this documentation site, a huge, huge benefit. Otherwise, the second feature really seems kind of unnecessary or not so glamorous, and that is that this compiles all of our SAS files and things into a single CSS file that we can easily attach to any project. Other than the normal situation there, one of the big benefits is that, as is explained here, all a developer has to do is place this in the top of the sheet and this in the bottom so that they have the full UI toolkit styles and any of the custom JavaScript that we've written to make our components work the way they're supposed to. Super easy for them to get things installed, just like you might have found when you learned about Bootstrap the first time. Very easy to just attach that Bootstrap library and then you're ready to go. So that said, let's now look at how this site is built, how we get each of these components documented and styled. All right, so I mentioned that we're going to be working in the source folder, so let's take a peek at that. Let's start from the bottom and work up. First of all, the views folder contains these sort of source files that become each of these main pages in the documentation site. And generally, you can leave these outer files here alone because they're all set up to be kind of the root pages of this documentation site. Once you get a hang for things, you might decide that you want to create some additional files here. No big deal, pretty easy to do. But as you're getting into it, you can really leave these alone. The layouts folder contains some other configurable files that basically assemble all the different kind of nuts and bolts to make this documentation site. So if you wanted to provide some of your own markup or do some of your own things in this area, you can do that. But the pages folder, this is where we can create our own kind of combination pages where we bring together the toolkit components that we have built elsewhere. Okay, so we'll point back to this folder and file in a moment. So looking up to the next folder, we have this very important folder, the materials folder. This is where we create each of those tiny components and larger structures. So the only structure they gave us is form. So we'll get to that, but let's look first at these small components. So again, this is just a sample set. You can add or remove any of these that you like, but let's say that we wanted to adjust what's going on here with buttons. When you pull up a file like this, button.html, notice that there is a little bit of front matter, and that is content that's usually placed between two sets of triple dashes, and the key notes, colon, and then pipe, and then we can enter our documentation here using markdown format. So we could say buttons are created like this. See below. Note that you can also add button to any element and it will behave like a button. Okay, so I'm just adding that content to show you that you can do formatting like in Markdown and bada bing bada bang. We've got browser sync on here, and this auto refreshes. The whole toolkit is rebuilt and shows that new content in your markup. So let's say what's happening, or you can see then what's happening is that this little page is being pulled in and assembled and shown here among the other components that are over here in this folder. So if we wanted to add to this markup, notice that we can toggle the markup on and see the button tag that we have here. We could also go in here and add some other content. So let's say that we wanted to show off the fact that we can make hyperlinks look like buttons in our toolkit. We could add some markup. Bada bing, bada bang, that markup appears here, and of course we would need to have styles wrapped around this to actually make the idea happen, but perhaps I'm trying to show off the idea of adding a class of btn to make it look like a button, and of course I don't have the styles to actually make that happen, but that's how you would create the markup side and the documentation for this. So what about the style side of things? Well, let's skip up a few folders to the assets directory, where you can see we have two subfolders. Fabricator contains all of the scripts and styles that are used to create the documentation site itself. So you can come in here and do some customization if you would like to change the way some of these things look. So for example, we might want to just change the color of the sidebar text over here. So you can see, okay, that's coming from F menu A in menu SAS file line 2. So we would go to partials, menu line 2, there it is, and there's where there's a background color being added, and there's also, let's see, the A tag down here. Yep, there's the color. So we could go in here and we could say red. And then those change to be red. Okay, so you can see how to customize the actual documentation site by modifying any of this. So you could rip it all out and start again from scratch if you wanted. Most likely it just would be easier to get in and do some of the customization here. So that's basically what I did in the sample site we looked at the beginning of this video. I went into this Fabricator folder and customized each of these styles so that the overall wrap here had its own look and feel. But the toolkit itself, the styles for the components and things like this that are actually going to go in the project are here in the toolkit folder. You can write your own JavaScript and your own styles. So notice that they just have a very basic thing in here, and this is going to affect the components themselves. So if I go in and I say I actually want this to be a serif font, that has now applied that change to the whole site, which is a little bit annoying that it affects everything. But the cool thing is it does compile separately from the Fabricator styles into our own toolkit styles, where we can see that our serif fonts are described there. So bottom line is, for all of the customizations that you want to do, say to style buttons, you're going to do them here somewhere in the styles folder. So we might say things that have the button tag and the button class are going to get a border none and padding 5 pixels, 10 pixels, and background color Rebecca purple. Okay, you can see the work in progress right there. And so maybe we want the foreground color to be white. And they're still not looking identical. Let's make them both display block. Or let's do inline block. And then let's set the font size to be the same. And they both need to be serif. Okay, and now they're looking more and more alike. So no text decoration. All right, so you can see with just a few styles, we've applied the idea we were talking about. And now technically in our documentation over here, the button tag does not need that class anymore. Okay, so to the point, we could come down here and we could also say p tag with a class of button. is going to also look a whole lot like some of those other buttons. Okay, so that is the gist. Now it's all up to you in terms of getting in here and doing what you would like, whatever you'd like to do with the styles. So that could be creating separate partial sheets and breaking things out in a very detailed way, just to give you a sense of what mine looked like. If I switch over here and show you my Assets Toolkit Styles folder, I have a main toolkit file that is bringing in a reset file and then a bunch of partials and then some customizations for app header and footer, and then 2 different pages customizations, as well as some just quick testing things. So in partials you can see each of those separate files, and for example let's say the chip file has just a few settings for the chip components. Okay, so I've very much made it very modular, making it easy for me to get in and edit very specific pieces and keeping it nice and organized. Okay, so that takes us through how to style, and we were looking specifically in here at materials at the components. Those are the small pieces. Note that you can name as you create new items. Let's say we wanted to create a, oh boy, the often overlooked block quote. We create a new one called, oh no, I'm sorry, not block quote, code tag. We can just call it code.html, whatever we call it. Of course, I put it in the wrong folder. Silly me. So this does not belong here. It belongs in our Fabricator demo. So we come over here and we go new file, code.html, and we can paste in our code. Okay, and now you see that the code component has appeared over here, and we can add our own notes. So we again add the front matter here, and the keyword notes, followed by a pipe, and then we can say code can be used to mark inline code samplers. Okay, and there is our little bit of documentation. Okay, so notice that I just created a file, I named it whatever I wanted, but there are also some nice features built into Fabricator that you can actually put a number up in front of these, and it's going to automatically use that for how these are ordered. So it's now the first one, and maybe I want, block quote, no, the text area, to be the second one for some reason. So they're alphabetical by default, but you can change those values and see them sort here. But note that those numbers are pulled out in terms of what code we see here, which is really nice. Okay, you can also do subfolders. So let's notice what happens here with the subfolder. The name of the folder appears here, and then the items inside of it also appear below it, but at a lower heading level. So it creates some hierarchy, which is just what you'd expect when you kind of nest things like this. So feel free to create your own folders, add or remove to create any of the components you'd like, and have at it in terms of creating your small components. Now in terms of the larger structures, what you can see here is the use of partials. So we've added some form markup, but then these funny little things are partials that refer to other components. So when we say double braces and then greater than sign, and then this little bit of text, we are saying import here the text input component. So that is this guy over here, right? So if I go to form, I should see the actual markup from the text input. So let's see, inside of this div here, div open and close, we get a label and an input. So if I go over and look at that text input here, sure enough, there is the label and the input. So the structures here, the idea is you're probably going to be pulling together some new markup plus putting in some of the existing components that you have from over in the other areas. And so same thing goes that I could put in here my code partial, and I don't need to include the number at the beginning. it just does a it's smart enough to exclude the number and the dash and goes right into the code, and there is that snippet itself. Now, if I wanted to work with something in this subfolder, that is going to need a little bit different treatment, but it's not too complex. It's just the folder dot and then the item inside the folder. And you got to spell the folder name right. And then there it is. So very nice and easy to be able to take some of these smaller components and assemble them into larger structures and show off the styling that you have for them. All right, that same idea carries over now if we flip back down to that views folder again. Remember we talked earlier on about the pages folder here inside of views. So this is a place where you can do that same idea of pulling together some of your custom components and structures and show them off all together in larger pieces. So here we have a component, the paragraph component, but here we have a structure, the form structure. All you need to do is put the name of the structure there. So let's show off a new structure. Let's go in here and do a new one called thumb. All right, so let's say that thumbs are composed of a UL and a bunch of LIs that have code partials in them. Okay. All right, so there we go. There we see the structure that we added, the thumb structure. Maybe we also need to put a class of thumb on these. So now we have our thumb structure prescribed, and we could go to one of our pages and show that off. So we could come in here and say, also put the thumb structure. All right, so when we go to a page, we're actually going to be taken to a whole brand new page where there's none of the documentation wrapping around us, and we can really see the whole style set in its glory, and there you see our little thumbs. Okay, so tons of things that you can do with Fabricator. Thankfully, not much to learn, but lots and lots to do in terms of exploring and customizing. So I encourage you to have at it. Now, when it comes to the classic case of how do we track our changes and store this in a GitHub repo, what we're going to want to do here is to create a new repo out of our folder. So again, that's going to be going to the File menu and choosing Add Local Repository. I'm sorry, I was wrong about that. It's File New Repository. And we're going to stay in the root folder that our repository is placed inside of, so it's in the W3PRS folder, and it's called Fabricator Demo. So we're not clicking on Fabricator Demo, we're in its parent folder, all right? But we're going to type in the very same name as the folder, and this is where GitHub Desktop is then going to create a new folder, or if this folder actually already exists, it's going to use it. So you've got to spell it exactly the way the folder that already exists is named. And then you can change any of the settings here that you'd like. I think leaving them just as is fine. Now when we click Create Repository, it's going to take a minute because there's a lot of files in this repository. But once it's done, we can switch to History and see all of our files have checked in. Going back to Changes, we can pull something up and try to make a change. And then we should see it tracked over here. It did indeed track that change, so we've confirmed that we're connected and working the way we're supposed to. All right, so with the repository created, now what we can do is automatically create a new GitHub repo and publish to it by just this one button here. So we want to push it to github.com. We can give it whatever name we would like. I'm just going to leave Fabricator Demo here. And we want to uncheck Keep this code private because that requires an upgraded account. And if you have any organizations you want to publish to, you can. Likely you want to leave things at just the kind of defaults here and then click Publish Repo. So this is now going to push all of your files up to actual GitHub. We go to repositories and we should see that repository has pushed up here along with all the files that we tracked. So of course you're going to want to create a develop branch and work on that while you complete your project work, and then eventually create a pull request to invite my feedback on it as you work. Alright, good luck and enjoy Fabricator.